I mean, for anyone that's sitting here being like, well, how do corporations influence the media? They're a totally different thing. Like, how would you explain how that relationship works and how they have an influence on the way the news is portrayed?
Yeah. So, for example, a lot of the same companies that are, let's say, I don't know, contractors, military industrial complex companies, right? Those same companies own media outlets. So those media outlets are not going to speak truth to power on military actions, on foreign policy. You're not going to get an unbiased view because their donors will shut that down. You're not going to get investigative reports on really good like alternative fuels and different things because the fossil fuel companies are advertisers, huge advertisers. Big pharma is a huge advertiser on the station. So you're getting the control of both the person who owns the media organization and what's in their best interest, which I can assure you financially is not in our best interest. And then you also have the interests of their advertisers. And that's an extremely powerful thing. So when you have that in conjunction with those same advertisers, like whether it's big pharma or fossil fuels or the military industrial complex, those same donors also have lots of lobbyists and buy lots of congresspeople. So it's this it's like a siege from every angle. They have taken over every branch of our government, all three branches of our government, and they have taken over the fourth estate. And it's just, we are an oligarchy. We are an oligarchy that has this sort of contrived appearance of a democracy that isn't real. And they are starting to get more and more fascist. And this has nothing to do with our political parties. This is global. This is happening globally. So in this country, we get distracted with the party nonsense and all of that. But all roads lead to the same thing, is infringement of civil liberties, grasping of more money and power by the elites and the oligarchs, and more people falling below a minimum standard of living, thereby losing more and more power. When you're struggling to live, you don't have time to be speaking truth to power. You're just trying to figure out how to feed your family. The more desperate people get, the more we'll fight amongst ourselves. It's like, it reminds me of like ancient things, like when you talk about like ancient civilizations and you look back on how they kept everything in order, this is how.
Yeah, I mean, like something that's always interesting is like when I have when I have discussions with people about things like this. Like I was talking to my brother about this recently, and he said, "Do you really think that this like crisis and moment is being used as a power grab, essentially, like to take more power from the people and give it to the power brokers who are already sort of over, like pockets running over with money and influence?" And he said, you're being crazy. Like they're just stupid, incompetent people. They're not actually like doing this. And I'm like, look, like show me a moment in history when governments all over the world have taken the powers that they're now taking and then given them back peacefully, like outside of wartime. And he was like, yeah, well, I don't know as much history. And I was like, look, I'm not like a big student of history, but I know these things happened in the past. And why do you think it is that people don't believe that, even though we have the entirety of human history to sort of take examples from some of the horrible dictators throughout the 20th century, of like clamping down, taking more power, becoming horrendously corrupt, and all of the problems that come along with that particular sort of scenario, and then don't think that it's possible now, like post 2000, everything was rosy and people weren't bad anymore. And why do you think that cognitive dissonance occurs where people don't think it can happen again?
Yeah. And this is really interesting. So I recently had Tom Hartman. I don't know if you're familiar with Tom Hartman on my show. He has a book about the history of American oligarchy. And this could probably be applied just globally. I mean, he's examining it American historically, but things happen in a 40-year cycle. And what's interesting, like when you look at, like in our country, it had to do with the oligarchs taking over during, after slavery, and then the fall again, and then the rise again. And like, it really examines how this happens. And it's almost like as soon as the people who are dead, who would remember it, then it starts happening again. So it happens like over the. It's really fascinating because I had never looked at it that way before, but I think that that's the case. And now, with the fact that there is no fourth estate, it makes it so much easier to corral people. But there's a variety of things. Selective memory is definitely part of it. And the fact that we were never properly informed in the first place. A lot of things is, you see it hindsight, but I don't know your education system. Ours lacks very, very much. Ours is extremely lacking. So the history that we're taught, the history that is prioritized is not the history that is going to be relevant in being able to overturn an oligarchy, right? That's not, they're not going to keep giving you that information, but everything is cyclical. People can only take so much before they rise up. Power will concede nothing. It never has. And unfortunately, things have to get violent. That's history. And this is where this is going. We're no different than, like, let's say the Roman Empire or any empire. They eventually use their money and their resources infinitely more to control and kill than to help their people. So when you spend more money on your military than you do on providing for your own citizens, it's only a matter of time before you're going to implode. So at some point there's more of us than there are of them. And then there's a revolution, and then that gets and like, it doesn't have to be like a violent revolution. Like, for example, FDR in our country, that was one example. The barons, the after the stock market crash, there was just this desperation and this need. And so he came in essentially to save capitalism. People thought that, he was providing a socialist thing. And yeah, but because he recognized that if we don't have consumers, because nobody can afford to buy anything and people can't afford to live, then the money's going to dry up. So he came in at that point and put higher taxes and created work programs and did those things. And that was one cycle. And then it built up and built up and built up, and the greed and the greed and the greed. And then we had what we had with the crash. What was the next? Was like, we're talking like Reagan era, when you started to see another complete control and relaxing of regulations and crushing of labor. And it's like, okay, did all those people from the 40s forget what happened when there were people didn't have a basic standard of living and what happened to this country? And so, yeah, I think people forget, but it is cyclical. And to think that it's not going to happen to us is extremely short-sighted.
Like, you brought up a couple of things I want to address there. The 40-year cycle is super interesting because I've been reading a little bit about this thing called Strauss-Howe intergenerational theory. So it attests that things happen in an 80 to 100-year cycle through 4 generations to about 20 to 25 years. So basically it says that, and I'm going to butcher this because my notes aren't in front of me about it, but so you have like the 4 stages, and they call them, they kind of almost call them the seasons of history, or refer to them as the seasons of history. So you have like the initial period. So in this case, that was like the war. It comes like just after the war, comes just after a crisis, and you have all the society like renewed in this like belief in the systems and the structures and the institutions, and it's about like the societal collective good. And then as you kind of progress through the generations, like individualism becomes more important than the institutions that were built, till you get to a point of unraveling and then crisis, and then it starts again. And normally in their theory anyway, that crisis ends in some sort of violent conflict. And it would suggest that the authors of the book from, I think in 1987, they predicted that sometime around 2020 or 2020 to 2025, that there would be like a serious period of violence or upheaval or revolution or something like that. But I am curious as to whether you think like violence is still what will come from this, because I'm also reading Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. That's it's a history of violence. So it's kind of tracking how, whilst we still have a lot of problems in the world today, that we live in the most peaceful time, at least like in the developed world, that has ever existed. Like, crime is lower, people live longer. It's just like a more peaceful and sort of placid time to live in. And there's some people that think violent conflict no longer works as a form of revolution, and that we're in this kind of like fifth generational warfare, like information war that's going on. Like, do you see like actual violence breaking out on the street, or like just mass protests, or do you think it's more likely to be some sort of like information war?
In my dream universe, I had this idea that the world is just one really smart hacker away from taking all the money from the haves and giving it to the have-nots. Like that, the entire thing could ultimately be solved in a digital way, and that is how the revolution, like that's ultimately how the power shift will occur. But I think that the more desperate and angry people get, and again, I'm speaking as to this country, we don't have healthcare. We don't have a minimum wage that's livable. We have some issues that are pushing people into dire straits at mass amounts. The pandemic has obviously exponentially made everything worse. We're looking at probably about anywhere from 20 to 30 million homeless people that we're going to be dealing with relatively quickly as soon as the eviction moratorium is lifted. Those people will all owe back rent. And these people also don't get any health care. So when I hear things like that, and I know how desperate people are because I've seen it, I wonder, what wouldn't somebody do? What would I do if my kid needed a particular operation, but my health insurance company didn't cover it? And I live in a country where I have to go into bankruptcy in order to be able to afford my kid's surgery. And then I'm just living my whole life in debt and owing, and just that kind of desperation, I think, can lead people to do all sorts of things. I think that if you keep people kicking down and you're kicking down, I think that eventually people have had it. I think that violence, unfortunately, is the result of mass gatherings of people that are angry and desperate. I think that's inevitable. But I don't think that ultimately that's what's going to, like, I don't think storming the Capitol building is ultimately, like, in a physical sense, going to work. No. But I think that when you have so much violence around the world, and I know what you're saying, like, yes, in our countries, in a lot of the Western countries, the crime rates are down. Our violent crime rates are down here too. That is true. But we've seen surges in things like domestic violence, PTSD, suicides, all sorts of things that we've seen increases in that wouldn't be considered under the violent crime category necessarily, either unreported or whatever the case may be. But I always say that from our country's perspective, you cannot expect to be so violent abroad. We're drone bombing, I believe, 8 countries right now. Civilians, people. We've bombed the same Doctors Without Border hospital twice. So you cannot
hang on, back up a second.
Oh, that happened. What? Oh my God. Oh my God. This was I want to say it was in Yemen. And this was years ago, before people were even talking about it. And Eva Bartlett was on the ground there and had been talking with you got to look this up. It was amazing. And I can't remember what show I watched her talking about this on, but she was actually there the second time that same hospital got bombed. So she had heard that from the people there that it had happened prior. And then she was actually there for the second time. And when you're us and you're working and you're giving the technology and the power to people in Saudi Arabia to do this, okay, you're not going to tell me that that's an accident. You don't accidentally bomb the same hospital twice. So we're involved in all of this all around the world. And people in our country live in this little bubble because most people don't even know that that's going on. And yet it infiltrates everything about us. Why do we have such militarized police departments? What is that about? Right? Like, all of this comes from this just general, we are violent people. Humans are violent. No other species does that. Like, we are violent, and you cannot be colonialist, imperialist, violent people abroad and not have any violence at home. That's just, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Yeah. And so that's what people are going to start to realize here that don't know what we're doing overseas. And that's why there's this disconnect, because people, They just see it every once in a while. There's a protest that gets out of hand. They don't see the festering, bubbling nightmare that is produced by what we do abroad, either in creating people that hate us, like in Gaza, or whether it's from bombing people in Syria, or whatever it is that's causing people to flee and be desperate and have no means. And I think that you can only push people so far. I do.
Yeah. I think to that bubbling resentment, you can add destabilizing South American regimes and African regimes, and just sort of slowly further impoverishing the vast majority of people in America. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, or sign up to our mailing list. Thanks a lot to our sponsor, ExpressVPN, the #1 most trusted VPN. Get lightning fast connectivity with servers in 160 locations across 94 countries. Keep your browsing privacy safe with ExpressVPN and get a 35% discount on 12 months of ExpressVPN when you follow the link in the description below. Don't forget my book is now out and available to order on Amazon and on bookshop.org. That's Brexit, the Establishment Civil War. And most importantly, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.